After the release of the critically and commercially polarizing Final Fantasy VIII, Yoshinori Kitase began work immediately on a new Final Fantasy game for the 6th generation of consoles. However, Square wanted one more Final Fantasy game for the PS1. Since Kitase's time was taken up working on the first Final Fantasy game for the PS2, that meant that Square brought in one of their old friends, the creator of Final Fantasy's active time battle system, Hiroyuki Ito, who also served as co-director for Final Fantasy VI, to be the sole director for this game. This is the only game where Ito is credited as the sole director, and the last Final Fantasy game where he is given top billing in the credits in any capacity. Thrusting Ito into the spotlight certainly paid off for Square, as this game would go on to receive the highest Metacritic score of all the Final Fantasy games, and selling more than 5.5 million copies in its lifetime. Today, I will be reviewing the HD remake of this game that was released for the PC in 2016. Now, before we begin, I need to make a quick disclosure. I recently got out of a breakup. I even made a very short video about that. I feel I should disclose that once again because of the very real possibility that my sadness could adversely affect my opinion of this game. Whenever I review a game, I review my experience with the game as much as I review the game itself, and who you are at the moment is scientifically proven to have a profound effect on your perception of the piece. Games are never the same thing to each person, even if the majority of us agree that a game is great or that a game is awful. I will do my level best to give this game a fair and impartial assessment despite this recent setback in my life, but I cannot guarantee that this life event will not, at least subconsciously, have an effect on today's analysis. So please give me the benefit of the doubt. In addition to that, I also want to make it clear that this retrospective video is being written on the assumption that you have already seen all the Final Fantasy retrospective videos on this channel from 1 to 8. While it isn't strictly required that you watch all 8 of the previous retrospective videos, you will get the most out of this video if you are watching them in order. So for those of you who are coming in late to the party, I highly recommend you start watching that playlist from the beginning. So, with all disclosures out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy IX Retrospective. In the Final Fantasy VIII retrospective, I complained about how the game, which was released in 2019, didn't even have native support for 16:9. Well, I can sort of make that criticism here. Final Fantasy IX is rendered in this weird resolution that, according to my measurements, comes out to a 103:72 aspect ratio. Has there ever been any television set or computer monitor that was built with that resolution? Well, whenever I play a 1280x720 resolution, instead of giving us some plain black margins on each side, we instead have these weird textures on each side that somewhat resemble black cement. I'm sure people are typing away in the comments telling me what these textures actually are, but black cement is the best I can come up with to describe them. So that begs the question, is this better than how 8 handled it? Well, it's hard to say. It's better in the sense that this makes it easier for me to record the raw footage for this retrospective. In Final Fantasy VIII, in order to fill the entire 16:9 screen, I had to first record the footage, then stretch it out, set it to blurry, then create an unblurry version of it in 4:3 with a red box around it and place that over the blurry version. That's just my style for doing games that aren't 16:9 out of the box. When WWE uploads its legacy footage, it likes to place some WWE logos on either side of the screen. Some people like to use curtain graphics in their margins. I personally like to use the stretchy, blurry red box style. Well, with Final Fantasy IX, because the game can technically be considered 16:9 already, I don't have to do any of that. I can just record the footage and then throw it on YouTube as an unlisted video. However, bear in mind that I only do the stretchy, blurry red box format because that's just my style. I came up with that style entirely on my own. Nobody forced me to use that style, and it certainly isn't Square's, or any game developer's, responsibility to cater to the individual video editing styles of any one YouTuber. So while Final Fantasy IX is certainly easier for me personally to record footage with, I can't really say that's a genuine triumph of game design. For casual players, it's hard to tell if these margins are better than what they did with Final Fantasy VIII's remaster. On the other hand, it's nice that they did something, anything, to make this into something remotely resembling an actual 16:9 aspect ratio. On the other hand, the plain blank margins from Final Fantasy VIII can at least be explained away by suggesting that maybe the developers didn't think to program in proper 16:9 support. But with 9, they clearly thought to add something to give it 16:9 support, and they clearly settled on just doing the bare minimum. With 8, there's plausible deniability, but with 9, they were simply lazy and there's no two ways about it. However, aside from the aspect ratio, I honestly cannot find evidence of laziness in any other part of the game's graphics. Recall last time I mentioned that 8's HD remaster looked like it would be suited for the 6th generation of consoles rather than the 9th generation that we're currently in. Well, with Final Fantasy IX, it would honestly be more excusable to have such a lack of improvement since that game came out a year later on the original hardware, while the HD remaster came out in 2016 rather than 2019. However, even though this game actually has an excuse for having less of an improvement over its original version, I can actually notice quite a bit of improvement in the graphics. No longer do I need to put the two versions side by side to be able to tell that the 2016 HD remaster has superior graphics. Now, with the game's audio, I once again have to praise this game for making an improvement over 8 in at least one area. Now, whenever I pause the game, the music always stops playing. Maybe there's a couple of instances in this game where the music continues to play when the game is paused, but I certainly didn't come across any during my playthrough. Now, if you want to know my opinion of the music itself, well, if you're watching the Final Fantasy retrospectives in order, you should know damn well by now that I think Nobuo Uematsu is a shit composer. Let me put it this way, remember in my Final Fantasy VII retrospective when I took the game's most iconic moment and set it to completely inappropriate music and sound effects in order to completely take the mickey out of that moment? Well, in Final Fantasy IX, I didn't even have to add the thematically inappropriate music. The game already went ahead and did that for me. Right now, you're looking at one of the cutscenes pretty early in the game. We can see people running, people jumping, people falling through the air, and explosions happening all around them. This is a cutscene that should be set to some bombastic, high-energy, high-octane music. You know what music that shit composer actually gave for this cutscene? Damn, Uematsu, way to take the wind out from under my sails. What's next? Death metal for a wedding cutscene? However, if it's any consolation to all you Uematsu fans out there, I definitely believe the battle music is nice and epic, and nice and energetic, and nicely encapsulates the feeling of fighting for one's life. Unfortunately, the boss fight music is significantly less thematically appropriate. Also, near the end of the game, there's a moment where Zidane, barely able to stand, soldiers on and is determined to take out Garland. The music that plays in this sequence is nice and epic. But unfortunately, Uematsu had to go and waste one of the few good pieces he actually wrote by continuing to use this music long after the epic scene has subsided. This music continues to play for about 10 minutes and it really overstays its welcome. Hey Uematsu, did anyone ever tell you that you're a shit composer? Because somebody needs to tell you that. In previous Final Fantasy games, I complained about the game not giving the player a sense of direction, often expecting the player to just know where to go and what to do, and often requiring the player to engage in awkward actions just to unlock some progression gate. But in 9, I rarely found myself wondering where I'm supposed to go to advance the plot. The game is usually pretty good about giving me an idea of where to go. Just as an example, in my first time visiting the city of Lindblum, Zidane heads back to the Tantalus hideout and then decides that he should probably check back on Dagger at the castle. Because Zidane says this to himself, he is also saying this to the player. This means that I know exactly what I need to do in order to advance the plot. I can still go off and do optional stuff, but I know that the plot will advance as soon as I return to the castle. No online guides necessary. Later in the game, right before the final dungeon of the game, the characters are all discussing how the Aoife tree is still at least half alive, thereby notifying me that I need to fly over to the Aoife tree to start the final leg of the game. This sense of direction is much appreciated, and it's something that has been sorely lacking in the previous games. However, while the main plot might be rather straightforward and give the player a much-needed sense of direction, the optional side quests in this game are ridiculously obtuse. After playing this game, I learned that this game actually had quite a few optional side quests. However, the game completely dropped the ball in telling me that these optional side quests were available, because I almost never came across an optional side quest, or at the very least never recognized such an opportunity for what it was. I almost never did the optional side quests. As such, I can't comment on any of these optional side quests because I literally didn't even do them. I did some of them. For example, I rescued a couple of humanoid rats in Burmecia and later met them in Lindblum as refugees. However, I did that side quest specifically because it was presented to me in a way that was very difficult for me to not notice. It's not like director Hiroyuki Ito was incapable of telling the player that optional content was available if we wanted it. He did a splendid job of doing exactly that, with the optional cutscenes. Whenever an optional cutscene becomes available, the words "Active Time Event" appear on the screen along with a little jingle. Whenever I press the select button, the game pauses and a menu comes up, allowing me to select which optional cutscene I want to watch from a list of available ones. So Ito clearly knows how to present the optional content to the player in a way that the player doesn't just not notice. But the optional side quests are often hidden in such a way that the player has to just know that they're there. For example, late in the game, right before I head off to the Aoife tree for the final leg of the game, an online guide told me that Zidane's most powerful weapon could be found underwater in the location where the Shimmering Isle used to be. Well, I fly my airship over to that location, descend into the water, and nothing happens. As it turns out, I can't just dive underwater with the airship to get hidden treasure. I need to unlock a specific ocean ability that was supposed to be unlocked over the course of a game-long side quest. I didn't do that game-long side quest because I didn't know about it. Sure, I suppose an online guide could have told me about this side quest, but I almost never deferred to the online guides in this game because, as I said before, the main quest was generally pretty straightforward and gave me a fairly decent sense of direction. As far as gameplay additions are concerned, this game really only has one addition, the item synthesis system. You put 2 or more items together and you get a new item. There's really nothing groundbreaking about this system. If you've played any RPG that came out in the 21st century, you know exactly how this works. It is what it is. However, seeing as this game was originally released in 2000, back when item synthesis mechanics were first gaining popularity, I honestly don't blame it for being as by the numbers as it is, because what could be considered by the numbers by 2020 standards was still new and fresh by 2000 standards. So what about the controls? Well, if you've played any Final Fantasy game prior to this, you pretty much know exactly how the controls work. However, I once again have to complain about the overworld camera. I mentioned in 8 that the camera was jerky and often very difficult to control. Well, in 9 it honestly seems to have gotten worse. However, there is at least one improvement this time around. Pressing the L2 button turns off the camera's auto-adjusting completely. You can still manually adjust the camera using the L1 and R1 buttons, but the camera never auto-adjusts whenever it's turned off. However, just by adding this option in, you are effectively admitting that the camera's auto-adjusting system is broken. In that case, why not just have the auto-adjust disabled by default? Or better yet, make it so that there is no auto-adjust at all, like you did in Final Fantasy VII. This isn't really all that complex. The airship once again has really wonky controls. You press the bottom face button to move forward. Honestly, up on the D stick should be how you move forward, but instead, you want to know what actually happens when you press up on the D stick? The airship descends. What the fuck? Just throwing this out there, I absolutely detest inverted Y-axis controls. Pressing up to make my character look down, or pressing up to make my character go down, just feels so fucking awkward that it honestly seems like the game developers are intentionally trolling me. Now, I'm aware that in real life, this is how actual airplanes are controlled. You don't just press up to go up, you pull up in order to ascend, which means you hold down on the cockpit's joystick. However, while I am aware that this is realistic, at least when flying a plane, I also don't really care. I may not know how to fly a plane, but I can drive a car just fine. And as I mentioned in my Final Fantasy VIII retrospective, the awkward-ass controls for driving the car in that game are still annoying as fuck, no matter how realistic they might be. So overall, when it comes to the gameplay and controls, I have to say, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. I appreciate the improved sense of direction for the main plot, but I would have really liked it if they had given a similar sense of direction for the side quests. This item synthesis was an expected but still welcome addition, but then the controls for this game were nothing but a downgrade. Final Fantasy IX retains the active time battle system that was introduced in Final Fantasy IV, much to my chagrin. See my older Final Fantasy retrospective videos for details as to how I feel about that combat system. However, in terms of individual character abilities, this game returns to Final Fantasy IV's system of having unchangeable preset classes for each character. Dagger and Eiko are both summoners and white mages. They can never become any class other than summoner white mage hybrids. Freya is and forever remains a dragon knight, and Quina is and forever remains a blue mage. However, unlike 4, this game at least gives us the ability to choose our party members, at least halfway through. Zidane is the main character, so he is often required during party setup, but the other 3 slots are ours to choose from. So unlike 4, where you are often locked into whatever playstyle the developers want you to use at any given point in the game, in 9, you can come up with your own playstyle. Limit breaks have been abolished in 9 in favor of the trance system. Basically, if you take enough damage in a battle, you can go Super Saiyan and can unleash some extra powerful attacks until your trance meter returns to 0. The attacks which get an upgrade are dependent on that character's preset class. For example, Vivi is a black mage, so instead of his regular attacks simply doing extra damage, he instead gets the ability to cast 2 black magic spells per turn. Dagger and Eiko benefit the least from trances because their primary means of offense, summon spells, don't benefit at all from trance. Maybe their white magic is more powerful, but I honestly didn't find white magic to be all that useful in this game, especially in the late game when I could simply apply the auto-regen ability to most of my characters, more on that later, making healing magic almost completely unnecessary, since by the time my white mage's turn comes up and she can get around to actually casting Cura, that character's health has already gotten back up to full on its own accord. However, trance has at least one major mechanical disadvantage. It doesn't transfer from one battle to the next. If the trance bar is near full at the end of one battle, then I will start the next battle with the trance bar at the same level it was previously. But if it gets all the way to full on the last turn of the battle, I could end the battle before the character has the opportunity to unleash even a single tranced attack. Then, after the battle, the character's trance bar goes all the way back down to empty, forcing me to build up the trance bar all over again from scratch. The net result is that more often than not, I end up completely wasting my trances. I would really prefer 7s and 8s limit breaks, which don't go away until I actually use them, over the trance system any day. The gear has gotten an upgrade over 7's gear. I would say it's an improvement over 8's gear system, but seeing as how that game's progression system was tied almost exclusively to the overly complicated junctioning system, there's really nowhere to go from there but up. I really enjoyed 7's gear and progression system, so when I say that 9 has an upgrade over 7's gear, that's high praise indeed. While weapons are still locked to individual characters, for example, the fork weapons are exclusively for Quina, the lance weapons are exclusively for Freya, etc., etc., every other type of item can be equipped by anybody. However, unlike in 7, where individual weapons and armor had materia slots that you could use to equip certain abilities on characters, 9's gear has items that have abilities inherently part of those items. So for example, the Coral Ring has the Man-Eater and Insomniac abilities tied to it. By equipping that ring, a character can gain these abilities by grinding up experience points. Why is this an improvement over 7's gear system, you ask? Because once I've unlocked the abilities, I can keep those abilities even if I unequip the corresponding items. This allows me to build up a large arsenal of abilities and enabling me to switch between them on a dime without needing to worry about materia slots. To keep me from becoming overpowered and simply selecting every ability, the game uses a stone system. To activate each ability requires a certain number of stones. The more powerful the ability, the more stones you need to equip it. You get 1 stone for every level your character is, and since the maximum level is 99, that means you only ever have a maximum of 99 stones to work with. That sounds like a lot, but even 99 stones can seem pretty limited near the end of the game, so you can't just equip every ability and become invincible. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, auto-regen is already pretty overpowered, so if you want to become invincible, that's the closest you're likely going to get. Now, I used the in-game cheats to obtain the maximum level right off the bat. However, unlike the previous games, this game did not seem to come with a built-in cheat to turn off random encounters. This means that my playthrough would often get bogged down with quite a few random encounters that ultimately served no purpose, since I was already at the max level. Because of this, I quickly entered into the habit of running away from most battles by holding down the L1 and R1 buttons simultaneously. This leads me to my next gripe. How much time it takes to run away from a random encounter is ridiculously inconsistent. Sometimes I can run away almost immediately, while other times it takes upwards of 20 seconds for the run to stick. That is a pain in the ass. If I want to run away from a battle, just let me run away. Ideally, running away should be instantaneous, but at the very least, you should make it a consistent length of time. However, I actually discovered, completely by accident, a totally new function. If this was in previous Final Fantasy games, I never knew about it, but as it turns out, if I simply tap the R2 button, the battle switches to automated. The characters will only select regular attacks, but they do so automatically. I suppose this was designed to give the player the opportunity to skip through battles they could easily win. After all, since the characters are only doing regular attacks, it's not like the game is going to strategize for you. Therefore, you should only activate this mode when you personally are confident that your characters are powerful enough to defeat the enemies handily. However, I honestly find this solution to be a rather stupid solution to a stupid problem. Supposedly, the point of this feature is to enable the player to sit through the battles that are so easy that they don't have to think about them. But if that were the case, why not just give us the ability to skip those battles altogether? I guess it's to give the players the option of still fighting the battles if we really want to. But if that were the case, why not just give us the ability to turn random encounters on and off altogether? Or to reduce the frequency of random encounters? We had that option in Final Fantasy VIII, and not even from cheats either. Even on the original hardware during normal gameplay, some of our junction abilities could reduce the frequency of random encounters by 50% or disable random encounters entirely. So why not just bring that feature back? You could even make it an ability that would require stones to equip. The option to automate random encounters is simply inferior because we still have to sit through the battles, and that's just boring. Continuing with the tradition set in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX contains a wide variety of mini-games to break up the repetitiveness of just going through a static overworld or dungeon map and getting into random encounters. Like Final Fantasy VIII, I find the mini-games on display to be rather mundane and by the numbers. Now, I should point out that I did very few mini-games that weren't directly part of the main quest. Due to the aforementioned problem of the game not properly disclosing to me that these side quests were available, I'm sure there were just as many mini-games that I didn't do simply because I didn't know they existed. There were a couple of optional minigames I did, either because I stumbled upon them by chance, or because I noticed them in one of the few times I actually used an online guide. The first minigame I encountered was a jumping rope minigame with Vivi and a few other girls. This is the first of only 2 minigames I did in this game that is not directly tied to the main quest. It is the only optional minigame that I stumbled upon. For the other one, I read about it in one of the few times I consulted an online guide. Anyway, this is as basic as a minigame can get. You time your button press so as to time your jump. There's no penalty for failing other than having to start over. However, for as mundane as this minigame is, it asks for an astronomical investment from the player in order to get the maximum reward. In order to get the highest reward from this minigame, you have to do 1,000 consecutive jumps. Dear God. Bear in mind that you aren't even doing anything truly engaging here. You're literally just pressing a single button in rhythm. This isn't like the card game Tetra Master, which actually has some legit strategy and multiple paths to victory. Getting 1,000 Tetra Master wins in a row would actually take some serious skill. To get 1,000 consecutive jumps in the jump rope minigame doesn't really take any skill. The only way to do this is to avoid succumbing to your own fucking boredom. Later, as we put on the play, I Want to Be Your Canary, we enter into a choreographed sword fighting minigame. This is the first minigame you have to play as part of the main quest. Bear in mind that you're putting on a play in this section of the game, so your goal is not to defeat your opponent, but rather to choreograph the fight in such a way that it provides maximum entertainment for the audience. As such, you're supposed to work with your opponent rather than attempt to subvert him. Playing into this, your opponent will randomly select one of 8 random buttons, either a face button or a direction on the D-pad, and you are tasked with pressing that same button. Of course, each button only appears on screen for a brief moment, so you have to be quick in pressing the corresponding button. Because of this, you're likely going to make the occasional mistake, if for no other reason than you have to act without actually having time to think. Fortunately, you get unlimited tries to get a perfect score of 100 out of 100, so I honestly cannot say that the difficulty is too great for this early in the game. Later down the line, Steiner and one of the Tantalus bandits named Marcus are trapped in a dome cage hanging from the wall. Yes, it was literally that much time that had passed before I got another minigame. In order to escape, we need to press left and right on the D-pad in a specific rhythm in order to get the cage swinging in a pendulum motion in order to knock itself into the wall. This took quite a bit of practice for me to get right, primarily because, unlike the jump rope minigame, the timing needed didn't stay the same with each cycle. Instead, whenever I was supposed to switch from left to right, changed as I made progress towards victory, which makes sense. After all, as I get closer and closer to smashing into the wall, the distance traveled by the pendulum increases, and therefore takes more time to reach the height of its next pendulum swing. So unlike the jump rope minigame, you do have to be paying at least a little bit of attention, as you can't just press the buttons on sheer muscle memory after you've got the rhythm down. However, like the jump rope minigame, I cannot imagine myself staying engaged enough to play this minigame to literally 1,000 repetitions, so I'm glad I only had to do this minigame once and then never again. Later on in the game, when we returned to Alexandria, I checked an online guide and noticed that I had the option to do a foot race minigame, and I personally consider this to be the worst minigame in the entire fucking game. At least of all the minigames I played. Basically, some mother wants to whip her son into shape and enlists Vivi to race against him in a foot race to improve his running speed. To win in this minigame, you have to press the left and right face buttons alternately and rapidly. Unlike the jump rope minigame, there's no rhythm or timing to these button presses. You literally just press them alternately as fast as you can. But like the jump rope minigame, there is likewise no skill or player engagement to this minigame. This is the epitome of a mindless button masher. Also, like the jump rope minigame, the level of commitment to this minigame that is required in order to get the maximum reward is simply off the charts. However, I consider this minigame to be even worse than the jump rope minigame because as I did this minigame, my hand got cramped because of all the button mashing. The jump rope minigame was boring and tedious, but this minigame literally caused me physical pain. As you enter the marshes of each continent, there is a section where Quina, provided he is in your party, has the opportunity to engage in a frog-catching minigame. Since many of Quina's abilities get more powerful the more frogs you catch, this minigame is pretty important to Quina's progression. However, there is absolutely no challenge to this minigame. To catch a frog, you run up to it and press the bottom face button. That's it. However, you can't just run up to all the frogs. In order to create an artificial sense of difficulty for a minigame that has literally no difficulty whatsoever, Ito decided that you could only catch a frog if it was on land. You can only catch a frog if you were literally right on top of it, and Quina can only go onto dry land. This means that if the frog decides to stay in the pond where Quina cannot traverse, I am stuck waiting patiently for that damn frog to move away from that damn pond. The only thing stopping me from completing this minigame in mere seconds is an RNG that is entirely outside of the player's control. Oh, heaven forbid we actually, I don't know, program the frogs to react to the player's movement in such a way that forces the player to make awkward motions in order to corner the frogs against walls or something to the point where there is simply no escape. Heaven forbid we actually require some player skill in this minigame. Heaven forbid we actually provide a challenge of any sort. That would actually be fun. And we wouldn't want that, would we? Pretty late in the game, Sid, who is a frog at this stage of the game, is tasked with stealing a key from a monster. The monster will make occasional glances in our direction. If it sees Sid making a move towards it, presumably the monster will eat Sid as soon as he gets close enough. So Sid has to make like a statue whenever the monster is looking at it in order to be able to sneak past the monster. Like the choreographed sword fight scene much earlier in the game, this minigame has some tension to it because there is a strict time limit. Previously, the correct input only remained on screen for about 2/3 of a second. Here, there's a cumulative time limit of 10 minutes that doesn't reset every time Sid has to restart the minigame. So if you fail the minigame enough times, the timer can provide some honest-to-goodness nail-biting tension. I must confess that this minigame did a pretty alright job of making me nervous. It's no car chase minigame from Final Fantasy VII by any means, but it's still pretty good. This game also tries its hand at providing some puzzles the player must solve in order to progress through the dungeons, and they all fall flat on their face. This is not the first game in the series to try this. As I mentioned in the Final Fantasy VI retrospective, 2 of that game's dungeons had some pretty engaging puzzles revolving around standing on switches to open pathways. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy IX's dungeon puzzles fall short of the bar. In the sewers of the city of Clera, Dagger needs to do a very basic lever-pulling puzzle in order to clear a path so that some bug bus can take her out of the city. Alas, there was hardly any puzzle-solving skills needed to do this puzzle. On the left side, I pull the lever and nothing happens. I go over to the right side and search for another lever. I pull that lever and something happens. I go back to the other lever and pull it again and something else happens. Poof, puzzle solved. Why even put this in the game? This game is rated T for teen, so you couldn't possibly have felt that the game's target demographic might actually be challenged by this puzzle. So, was it just put in there to pad for time? If so, then fuck time padding game mechanics. Later on, there's a dungeon called Fossil Rue, which is supposed to be a labyrinth. We hitch a ride on the bug creature, but the bugs don't just go wherever we tell them to, like a horse. Instead, you have to use the valves to make waterfalls block off the paths you don't want to go. Now, this had the potential to be really interesting, but alas, an interesting concept suffers from crappy execution. There are only 4 valves that you can use to turn the water on or off. Each valve only has 2 states that you can choose between, and most importantly of all, the paths that each valve open up never overlap. For each valve, one state leads to further in the dungeon, and the other state leads to an optional treasure and a dead end. If you get the treasure, you then have to backtrack, change the valve again, and then go deeper into the dungeon. This could have been a really interesting puzzle where you have to memorize the dungeon layout and figure out the right combination of valves to leave on or off in order to either get through the dungeon as fast as possible or to get the most amount of treasure out of the dungeon, whichever you prefer. But instead, because every valve is entirely separate from the other, it just becomes a matter of determining whether you want the optional treasure for this section of the dungeon. The dungeon becomes entirely linear because the paths you open up never overlap with each other, so it isn't even really a maze. Near the end of the game, there's a micro puzzle surrounding the control of an alien elevator. Basically, you select a number on a lever, and that number corresponds to some position that the elevator in the next room is in. Depending on what angle the elevator is facing, I can either make the most direct progress through the dungeon, or I can acquire some optional treasures. Unfortunately, there's really no puzzle-solving skill to this either, it's just trial and error. It mostly comes down to deciding what treasures you want, if any, and then choosing the correct number for the elevator. Once again, a potentially interesting concept is ruined thanks to paper-thin execution. So that just leaves us with Tetra Master, easily the most prolific minigame in this entire game, and the one the developers clearly put the most amount of development and effort into, although that's not a high bar to clear. Now, I consider this to be a mandatory minigame because there is at least one section of the game where you absolutely have to play this minigame, but you can play it against nearly any NPC in the game for the entirety of the game, even when you're on another planet, both before and after this mandatory tournament, so there is still an optional element to it. That being said, this game actually did a surprisingly acceptable job of notifying me that the optional portions of this minigame were actually available. Whenever I talk to an NPC, an exclamation mark will usually appear next to them to notify me that I can speak to that NPC. However, about half the NPCs in the game will also have a book icon appear next to them as well. Now, the book icon alone doesn't tell me exactly what I'm supposed to do, but it at least gives me some kind of indication that there's an extra layer of potential interaction with this NPC, prompting me to search an online guide for more details. In addition to that, at the beginning of the game, Vivi has to present his ticket to the ticket booth. He gets told that it's a fake ticket and is given 3 cards by the ticket lady. He's then told to speak to some guy for a rundown as to what exactly he's supposed to do with these cards. So while actually playing Tetra Master may be optional outside of this one time in the main quest, being notified that the option is there is not. See, this is what I was talking about in my Final Fantasy VII retrospective. If you're going to make content in the game optional to do, you should, at the very least, make it so that not being told that the content is there should require you actively avoid that notification, or you just straight up aren't paying attention at all. So as far as telling the player about this optional mini-game, I will at least give the game that much of a thumbs up. So what about the game itself? Well, it's basically a slightly altered version of Triple Triad from Final Fantasy VIII. Like Triple Triad, you select 5 of your existing cards, for a total of 10 cards across both players. Like Triple Triad, you place your cards on a grid in order to take control of your opponent's cards, and like Triple Triad, the winner is the player who has control over the most cards once all the cards have been played. However, this time around, instead of only having 9 slots you can place cards on, there's actually a total of 16 spots. However, this time around, anywhere from 1 to 6 spots on the board will be randomly filled in with walls. This ensures that there are always going to be at least 10 spots on the board that are eligible to have cards placed on them. In both games, you conquer your opponent's cards by placing your own cards next to them. In Triple Triad, you conquered your opponent's card if your number on the side of the card was higher than your opponent's number. But in Tetramaster, you conquer your opponent's card if one of 2 conditions are met. First, if your arrow on the side is pointing outward and your opponent's arrow on the same side is pointing inward, then you get your opponent's card automatically. However, if both cards are pointing outward, then whichever card has the highest number in the center gets the win. Also, you can conquer multiple opposing cards in one fell swoop, although I never quite got the hang of how you do it because I honestly don't care that much. This apathy leads me to one of my biggest gripes with this minigame. As fleshed out as it is, just like Triple Triad before it, I honestly find it quite boring. There's definitely some strategy and depth to it, but the fact that your success in this game is based on how powerful your cards are makes it just a little too pay to win for my tastes, even though you're not actually paying to win, if that makes any sense. So overall, the minigames in this game are once again rather bland. I really miss Final Fantasy VII's minigames, which were all over the place, but at least that meant we got at least one truly great minigame. Well, next Final Fantasy has one of the most popular minigames in the entire franchise, Blitzball, so fingers crossed that I'll get my wish next game and have a wide assortment of minigames, including at least one truly awesome one. Hey, if you made it this far into this video, you obviously must be enjoying the video, so why not show how much you enjoy my content by supporting me on Patreon, or by becoming a channel member for as little as $1 a month. Donate at least $5 a month and I will accept requests for video topics from you. Donate at least $20 a month and you have the right to directly assign me topics and be guaranteed to have your suggestions covered, subject to reasonable terms, of course. Click the join button below this video to become a channel member, or go to patreon.com/acerthorn to support the channel there. But even if you can't afford to donate even so much as $1 a month, there are still a few ways you can support the channel for free, which I describe in my 20-minute video, How You Can Support the Channel Without Donating. Check out that video for ideas on how you can help the channel grow without spending money. Either way, I hope you decide to support the channel in more ways than just watching this one video. Alright, recommencing the video you all came to see in 3, 2, 1. Once again, just like in 8, the main characters in Final Fantasy IX are criminally underdeveloped. Only a few of them get any character development or grow beyond their initial state. However, at least this game has an advantage over 8 in that the characters' personalities are actually explored in more than just one scene each. Quina is one of the biggest examples of this problem. When we first meet him, his primary interest in joining up with the group is to experience new delicacies from all over the world. Quina learns new blue magic spells by literally eating enemies in battle, so his love for food and desire to eat food provides an in-story contextualization for his blue magic abilities. Quina never really undergoes any change or character growth. His entire shtick boils down to exactly 2 things. He's a big glutton, and he has a speech impediment. That's it. He literally has no personality beyond those 2 things, and it gets old fast. Think about it this way. In Fallout 4, there's a merchant in Diamond City called Mo Cronin. He isn't a very deep character. Literally, the only thing that makes him even partially memorable is his laughably inaccurate account of how baseball was played before the apocalypse.
See, it used to be that this whole place was a stadium, and two teams would meet and play a game called baseball. One team would beat the other team to death with these things called baseball bats, and
a character with so little depth can work, as long as he's just a one-off supporting character who the player only interacts with once or twice the entire game. Instead, it's your Kates, your Pipers, your Valentines, your McCreadys. They're the ones who you're going to be spending the most time with, and therefore, they're the ones who have the most personality and undergo the most character development. Well, Quina feels like the Final Fantasy equivalent of Mo Cronin from Fallout 4. There's only so much mileage you can get out of a character whose entire personality begins and ends with glutton with a speech impediment. Eventually, you have to actually develop the character beyond those two starting traits, but Quina never does develop. And unlike Mo Cronin, he isn't just a one-off character, he's a main character. So the game's failure to give him any character development is a big strike against the game as a whole. However, as underdeveloped as Quina is, he has nothing on Freya, a dragon knight from Burmecia. She's a humanoid rat, and while this race of humanoid rats is featured prominently in the game, I don't think the race is ever given an official name. I certainly didn't catch the name of this race of humanoid rats in-game. Anyway, Freya's rat-like appearance is by far the most interesting thing about her, but as a character, Freya is hands down the biggest blank slate of a character this game has to offer. Quina at least had a few quirky character traits to make him interesting at first, before the novelty of those traits wore off. Freya doesn't even have that much. The closest Freya comes to having any kind of depth is that her ex-boyfriend, who was also a dragon knight in service to the king of Burmecia, was presumed dead for several years. However, it is eventually revealed that her ex isn't actually dead, but has amnesia. She is, of course, elated to know that her lover is still alive, but devastated to find out that she can't even reunite with him. This could have led to an interesting side quest, where Freya sought to undo her boyfriend's amnesia, or at the very least come to terms with it. But for some reason, Ito either didn't seem all that interested in pursuing that side quest, or it was one of the many side quests I never did because I was never given even the slightest inkling of how to trigger it. Therefore, the potential for an interesting character arc ultimately goes entirely unfulfilled, and so Freya remains a complete blank slate of a character. Steiner is a knight in service to the Queen of Alexandria, and spends the majority of the game as Princess Garnet's bodyguard. I honestly like Steiner. He's loyal to the royal family, but he also strictly believes in the rule of law. And since the United States is currently wrapping up a 4-year period where our president didn't give two flying shits about the rule of law, Steiner was a breath of fresh air. Bear in mind that I played most of this game during November of 2020, while playing the final legs of the game in early December 2020. Which means I was playing this game while Donald Trump was trying to usurp the democratic election and have the federal courts declare him president. So Steiner's dedication to the rule of law was especially refreshing for me, given the political climate in the United States while I was playing the game. Steiner enters the story when he is tasked with rescuing the kidnapped Princess Garnet. He also vows to bring Zidane, her abductor, to justice. However, he also realizes that Zidane saved Garnet's life. Because of this, he decides to petition for a reduction in sentence for Zidane, down to a life sentence rather than the death penalty. Now, he ultimately never gets that far because the plot escalates to world-threatening levels before he gets the chance to have Zidane sentenced, but he nonetheless came to that determination entirely on his own, using nothing but his own strict moral code. This is the moment that made me realize just how much I loved Steiner. He strongly believes in justice, so he can't let Zidane get away scot-free like Garnet would like. But at the same time, it isn't really justice if he doesn't take mitigating circumstances or extenuating factors into consideration. Besides, he ultimately does come around to respecting Zidane. He spends the first half of the game simply referring to Zidane as a thief or a scoundrel, clearly viewing Zidane with nothing but sheer disdain. But as the story progresses and Kuja starts threatening the entire planet, Steiner is forced to interact with Zidane in a peaceful manner. By doing this, he eventually starts to respect Zidane and even approves of his and Garnet's relationship. He might not have believed that Zidane was the good guy at first, but he quickly comes to terms with the fact that he can't argue with what's right in front of him. However, while I do enjoy the development that Steiner receives, I do have to admit that there are some serious flaws in its execution, which I will discuss when I discuss this game's subplots. However, there is at least one point in the game where Steiner acts really out of character. After rescuing Dagger from a pair of jester villains called Zorn and Thorn, Zidane reminds Steiner and his love interest Beatrix of their duty to protect the princess. Noticing that Princess Garnet is unconscious and nearly dead, Steiner and Beatrix stay behind and actively engage in combat with Queen Brain so that Zidane and friends can escape. This is completely out of character for Steiner. His duty is to follow orders from the monarch, not the princess. Him turning on the monarch in this case would be like if Secret Service were to start fighting against the president just because the vice president was in danger. It honestly seems that Steiner is doing this just because the plot requires it, not because it's actually his sworn duty to do so. Amarant is a disgraced security guard who was framed for stealing from the Trino auction house, which is the very business he was hired to protect. In an ironic twist of fate, it was actually Zidane, the very thief he ultimately ends up working for, that framed him for this thievery. It was actually Zidane who committed the theft, and then framed Amarant for it. He suspects that Zidane doesn't remember this moment, and neither Amarant nor Freya, the one he tells this backstory to, are ever seen actually telling Zidane about this, so Zidane probably never finds out. Because he's now disgraced, he is introduced in the game as a mercenary for hire, since it's now impossible for him to find legitimate work. While he is forced to do unscrupulous things just to survive, he still has a strong moral code that prevents him from doing things that are too far below the belt. For example, when his partner in crime, Lonnie, is taking Eco hostage in order to force the heroes to hand over one of the Eidolons nice and easy, Amarant stops her, despite it being counterproductive to his mission, because while he may be a criminal out of necessity, his moral compass means he cannot tolerate the taking of hostages, instead insisting on head-to-head combat with no cheap tactics whatsoever. This is a powerful establishing character moment for him. After he fails to defeat Zidane the honorable way, Zidane is astonished that Amarant expects him to be slain. Amarant is free to leave, but he sticks around and joins Zidane. It is later revealed that this is not because he feels indebted to Zidane for sparing his life, like Puss in Boots from Shrek 2, but because he wants to see what makes Zidane tick. Everything about Zidane seems to baffle him, and he hopes that by hanging around with him, he can figure out just what makes Zidane do the things he does. However, he never really undergoes any character development. He never really seems satisfied with what he learned about Zidane's character, nor does he ever grow as a character himself. There is one dungeon where he is supposed to learn the value of working with others, but this character development just comes so far out of left field that I honestly don't even want to call it character development. Amarant's supposed disdain for working with other people is brought up only at the start of this dungeon, and it has received absolutely no build-up prior to this moment. He didn't seem to have a problem working with everyone else when he first joined the group, and he also didn't seem to have a problem working with Lonnie to acquire the Eidolons. Sure, he ultimately turns out on Lonnie, but that's because she was using dirty tricks that he considered to be morally repugnant, not because he doesn't like having a partner. So why does Amarant hate working with people all of a sudden? It just comes out of nowhere. Well, aside from the complete failure to properly set up this character flaw in advance, the character arc in this dungeon otherwise seems surprisingly decent. He initially thinks he has proven himself right by reaching the end of the dungeon before Zidane, But then, as he attempts to make his way out of the dungeon, he falls on his ass and breaks a hip like a fucking elderly person. Well, to be fair, it's never fully explained exactly how he got in this predicament, but the implication here is that he just fell on his ass, so that's what I'm going with. Now, previously, Zidane simply decided not to kill Amarant, but here, he actively saves Amarant's life, much to Amarant's astonishment. Not only did Zidane not have to save Amarant, after all, there's a big difference between simply refusing to kill someone and actively saving them, the biggest difference being that Zidane's hands are clean in the latter scenario, but he did so even after Amarant had announced his intention to leave the group and set out on his own again, meaning he wasn't even Zidane's teammate anymore. So Amarant learns a valuable lesson about the benefits of having someone watch your back. Sure, it might slow you down in the short term, but that's a trade worth making if it's increasing your chances of survival overall. Eiko is a really confusing character. Oh, not her personality. Her personality seems to make sense, I guess. Eiko's personality mostly boils down to wanting to steal Zidane's heart away from Dagger. That's honestly about as far as it goes. She never really undergoes any character growth or character development either. No, it's the physical character itself that confuses me. Specifically, I can't seem to pin down her age. Is she a child or just a midget? Now, everyone seems to treat her like she's only 6 years old, but Eiko herself insists that she is a grown-up. Sure, her character's name selection screen also says that she's 6 years old, but I honestly don't consider those screens to be sacrosanct. After all, Vivi's name select screen says that he's about 11 years old, but it's eventually revealed that the Black Mages only have life expectancies of about 1 year. Sure, average lifespans are not exact, and there are plenty of organisms that outlive their species' average lifespans, but not by a factor of 11. For example, the average human lifespan in 2020 is approximately 79 years. There are plenty of people who live to be older than 79 years, but nobody's going to live to be 869 years old? That would be ridiculous! So no, the mere fact that Eiko's name select screen says that she is 6 years old is not dispositive to me. So what evidence is there to suggest that she's older than 6? Well, she falls in love with Zidane, meaning she must be old enough to experience a sexual attraction. She is also independent to an absurd degree, living mostly on her own. Sure, there are some Mughals living with her, but when she's resolved to make dinner for Zidane and friends, it's clear that she's the one giving orders to the Mughals, not the other way around. It's clear that she's the one in charge. But the biggest piece of evidence, at least for me personally, that she is a lot older than 6 is how she talks. Quina has a speech impediment, but Eiko talks more like a college professor than a 6-year-old. Betrayed by my own trusted Moogle, is this how I meet my end? Am I hallucinating? I'm the last survivor of my tribe. A natural disaster struck the village. Even the survivors suffered a great deal. What 6-year-old talks like that? What 6-year-old even knows the definitions of such words as hallucinating and survivor, let alone uses them in sentences like it's just their standard way of talking? It's not like Hiroyuki Ito just doesn't know how to write children who talk like children either. Later in the game, when we return to the city of Lindblum, we meet up with some humanoid rat refugees from Burmecia who we saved previously. We get introduced to their children, and they don't understand what a savior is. One of the kids says he wants a savior because all he knows about saviors is what his father had just told him, that it's a very special kind of friend. Sure, when you couch it like that, it sounds awesome. What he doesn't tell his kids is that in order to have a savior, you first have to be caught in a life-threatening, traumatic experience that will most likely psychologically fuck you up for life. Of course, the kids don't know that yet, because they're kids. So clearly, Hiroyuki Ito does indeed know how to write children who actually act like children and who know things that children know. By contrast, Eiko's level of intelligence, level of sexual awareness and level of independence is so high that I honestly find it hard to believe that she is even under the age of 16, let alone the age of 6. But alas, Iko admits to being under the age of 16, so I will at least accept that about her. Even then, her level of intelligence and independence is bordering on unacceptable, and I would have a hard time believing it were it not for the fact that this age range is true by Iko's own admission. But 6? There's just no way in hell she's only 6. No, Iko is not a 6-year-old, she is just a midget, and I don't care what anyone else says. Now, Vivi is the big one here for character development. He is the one who undergoes the most change and character growth throughout the game. He starts the game as an orphaned boy, around the size of an 11-year-old boy and also having a similar personality to that of an 11-year-old boy. He loves to have fun, he's paralyzed with fear when facing monsters in the forest, he cries when he can't see the play, and the ticket booth person is able to cheer him up by offering him toys. He gets swept up in the main plot, not because he has a personal stake in the main plot, at least not at first, but because he just found himself on board the Tantalus's airship right as it was taking off, so he crash-landed in the evil forest along with the pirates. So he ultimately ended up coming along for the ride. As he accompanies Zidane in an attempt to return to Alexandria, they enter the village of Dali, and Vivi notices that hundreds of black mages who look just like him are being made from an assembly line. This naturally freaks Vivi out and gives him a personal stake in the main plot, figuring out just where he came from and why this assembly line is even a thing in the first place. At first, he's scared about finding out the truth, afraid to learn he isn't even human. But of course, he soldiers on because, while the idea of learning he isn't human is frightening to him, the idea of never finding out the truth when he had the chance to is even more frightening than learning the unpleasant truth. I like that about him. We eventually stumble upon a village of peaceful black mages, and by interacting with these black mages, Vivi eventually realizes that he's going to die. Having since come to terms with the fact that he was manufactured rather than born, and that he has no actual parents, these interactions jumpstart his next character arc, coming to terms with his own mortality. Bear in mind that, unlike Iko, Vivi actually starts the game with a childlike innocence, so having to come to terms with the fact that he's eventually going to die is obviously quite chilling to him. However, with the help of his friends, well, mostly Zidane, he is able to accept that there's no point in worrying about death, specifically because it is inevitable. So worrying about it isn't going to do any good. Might as well just enjoy life while it lasts. Princess Garnet, also known as Dagger for reasons I'll get to in a minute, is a rather confusing character. Unlike Iko, there's nothing about Dagger's physical character that I have any questions about. Instead, it's her personality that baffles me. At the start of the game, Tantalus is plotting to kidnap her, but much to everyone's surprise, she sneaks on board the ship of her own accord and literally asks to be kidnapped. It's later revealed that she is in great shape because she's been training for quite some time now, specifically to escape the castle. However, in the entire game, we never get any explanation as to why exactly she wanted to be kidnapped. There's a time in Dali when Zidane asks her why she wanted that so badly, but she refuses to say. So instead of this being the beginning of a potentially interesting character arc, it honestly seems like an excuse just to get the plot moving. How is Tantalus supposed to actually kidnap the princess when she's surrounded by her royal bodyguards? Well, maybe she gave those bodyguards the slip. Wait, why would she give her own bodyguards the slip? Well, she wants to be kidnapped. Yeah, that's it. Wait, who in their right mind would want to be kidnapped? Do you want this game to get made or not? Right before entering the village of Dali, Zidane tells Garnet that it would be a good idea for her to pick a new name, since the people of Dali might recognize her if she uses her royal name. On the spot, she decides to name herself Dagger after Zidane's weapon of choice, which is why she is referred to as both Dagger and Garnet interchangeably throughout the game. Anyway, as we continue our adventures, Dagger eventually realizes that the Queen is indeed on a mission to conquer the world. Thinking that Brain is going to die if she goes up against Kuja, she insists on trying to save her. Even though she knows that her mother is committing a horrible atrocity for no other reason than being evil, she nevertheless insists on saving her. This is probably the first truly morally gray area in the Final Fantasy franchise up to this point. After she fails to save her mother's life, she becomes the new Queen of Alexandria. At first, she accepts her duties, claiming that she won't be able to adventure with the group anymore. However, her new career as queen quickly comes to an end when Kuja invades Alexandria, and the kingdom is completely leveled. Without a kingdom to rule over, Dagger really has no reason not to rejoin the group, so she does. However, after she visits her mother's grave one more time, she does something that really baffles me. She takes Zidane's dagger, you know, the one that she used as an inspiration for her fake name, and she uses it to cut her hair short. That alone doesn't sound like a big deal, but oh boy, the game somehow makes this into a big deal. The music is slow and epic. The cutscene is moving in slow motion. The camera zooms in on the act of her cutting her hair, and Zidane even gives a smile of approval. Hell, before she does it, she even calls this her last big decision, and asks Zidane to remember her the way she was. Is this supposed to mean something? Because from my point of view, it literally just seems like Dagger is wanting to wear her hair a little shorter than she's used to. Why is that such a big deal? It's literally just a haircut. Now, to be fair, this game is a JRPG, and the J in that acronym stands for Japanese, so perhaps this is something that really only makes sense if you understand Japanese culture. For example, many Dragon Ball fans might remember a scene where Gohan meets his mother for the first time after coming out of the hyperbolic time chamber, and she freaks out over Gohan having blonde hair. While that's a decent scene in its own right, one YouTuber I am subscribed to called Mr. Fusion provides some Japanese culture to help provide some additional context for this moment.
Chi-Chi's aversion to Super Saiyan, while seemingly tied into her prioritizing of studying over fighting, is actually a reflection of a different cultural idea. Japan is a very homogenized society, both in terms of behavioral expectations and physiology. I'm certainly not saying that all Japanese people look alike, but let's just say animation's tendency to give its characters a wide variety of wild hair colors is not exactly true to life. Dyeing one's hair blonde, especially at the time this came out, was seen as delinquent. So with that context in mind, it's somewhat understandable that Chi-Chi would think her innocent little son now looks like a punk. Explaining the joke! It always makes things funnier.
Well, along that same vein, I have to wonder, is Dagger's actions right here likewise something that really is considered a big deal, but only in a Japanese cultural context? Because while we're on the topic of Dragon Ball, let's also not forget that series also featured Videl being turned on by the idea that Gohan might want her to cut her own hair for no other reason than he thinks it looks cuter. But even barring that, I've seen plenty of Japanese women in real life who have short hair. So clearly cutting one's hair can't possibly be that big of a deal in Japan. So why does this cutscene treat it like a big deal? Maybe somebody can explain it to me down in the comments. Last but not least, it is eventually revealed that Dagger was actually born in the city of Madain-Sari, the place where we meet Ego. Through unknown means, she came to live in the Kingdom of Alexandria as a baby, where the original Princess Garnet had actually died from unknown causes. However, because this version of Dagger looked exactly like the original Princess Garnet, except for the horns on her head, the royal scribe decided to surgically remove the horns and let the royal family believe this was the original Princess Garnet and that the original never died in the first place. As you can probably tell from my tone of voice, I think this is a completely unnecessary backstory and only really serves to bog the story down. In Final Fantasy VIII, I criticized the backstory that the main characters all grew up together in the same orphanage as being a complete waste of disk space because it didn't enhance the story in any way. Well, here, I feel the same way about Dagger's place of origin. At least with Zidane and Vivi, learning about their true origins is actually important to the main plot. What does Dagger's backstory contribute to the story in any way? It honestly seems like it's just there to explain why Dagger and Iko are the only characters who can perform white magic and summon spells, which, quite frankly, doesn't need an in-universe explanation. Why can't it just be that the characters can all do what they do because they're all trained to do them? Steiner is good with a broadsword not because of his race or place of birth, but because he is trained in the way of the knight. Freya can jump up and use the spear attack, not because she's a humanoid rat, but because she is trained to be a dragon knight. What, you can't just say that Dagger and Iko are able to do these things because they're well trained in these two magical arts? What a complete waste of disk space. So that just leaves Zidane, the main character. Zidane's backstory is basically Goku's backstory. Now I know I've made references to Dragon Ball in nearly every Final Fantasy retrospective video so far. I think 7 is the only retrospective video that hasn't had a single Dragon Ball reference yet. But at least in this specific instance, I honestly don't know how this is anything but a blatant rip-off of Goku's backstory. He has a monkey-like tail. He was an alien who was sent to the story's home planet with the intention of destroying it and making it ready for his home planet's inhabitants to move in. But then, through a stroke of luck, he suffered amnesia and, rather than fulfilling his initial mission, ended up becoming the planet's savior. Hell, he even at one point refers to Kuja as his brother, putting him in the Raditz role, and Kuja even keeps his tail wrapped around his body. So, yeah, Zidane is Goku and there's no two ways about it. Now, to be fair, while Zidane's backstory might be identical to Goku's, his personality isn't. He's playful, sure, but he's also quite flirtatious with women of all shapes and sizes, even those he has no intention of actually picking up, like Freya. He also succumbs to depression and drowning his sorrows in alcohol, something Goku is never shown to do, and he ends up giving quite a bit of life advice to his friends. He starts the game as a pirate, and he isn't even the leader of the pirates. However, it's clear that he prefers to do things his own way, and this is established early on when he breaks away from Tantalus because he insists on sticking with Dagger. In terms of character development, his biggest character arc is the fact that he and Dagger ultimately fall in love by the end of the game. For the majority of the game, Dagger seems wholly uninterested in Zidane's flirtatious advances. At one point, Iko even asks Dagger point-blank if she loves Zidane, only to not get a straight answer. But at the very end of the game, after defeating the final boss, Dagger does express affection for Zidane. That being said, much like the Squall-Renoa romance from 8, I also find this romance to be egregiously lacking in chemistry, although you are free to place an asterisk on the end of that opinion due to the disclaimer I made at the beginning of this video if you are so inclined. Zidane does at least a little character development by himself. On the planet Terra, Zidane's home planet, he decides he's going to kill Garland because Garland is planning on killing everyone on Gaia. That's the planet this game predominantly takes place on. In doing so, he actively refuses the help of his friends, despite being so battered that he can barely walk. Eventually, Dagger talks some sense into him and convinces him that there is no shame in accepting help from his friends just as he has helped so many of them. However, this character arc is terribly executed for much the same reasons as Amarant's character arc is. The character flaw that the game seeks to rectify just comes out of nowhere and completely contradicts everything else about the character up to that point. Sure, he broke away from Tantalus, but not because he was a loner. There's never been any indication in the game up to this point that Zidane likes helping others, but doesn't like receiving help himself. So like Amarant, this character arc fails because it's all payoff with no setup. You need both for a character arc to work properly. So overall, the characters in this game are hit or miss. Vivi has the most interesting character arc, but he's really the only one with an interesting character arc. The majority of the characters receive virtually no character development whatsoever, and for that matter, Ito can't even seem to decide on what the characters even are. In my past Final Fantasy retrospectives, I noted that this franchise has a problem with how it handles its subplots. Usually the subplots in Final Fantasy games can fall into one of three major categories in terms of how they are poorly executed. The first category is when the subplots are brought up but then never resolved, or even mentioned again after their introduction. Examples of this kind of subplot include the Shattered Crystals subplot in Final Fantasy III, as well as Quistis getting fired in Final Fantasy VIII. The next example is subplots that get resolved immediately or almost immediately after getting brought up, resulting in a story that has a beginning and an end but no middle. Examples of this include Prince Alice's daddy issues in 3, Rydia's pyrophobia in 4, and Red 13's daddy issues in 7. Third and finally, we have subplots that get brought up once, then are resolved sometime later. However, these subplots tend to be resolved with no apparent catalyst or through entirely arbitrary means, without a clear cause and effect chain leading to the resolution. Instead, the resolution just happens. The most egregious examples of this kind of subplot include Rifia's blacksmith training in 3, Terra's will to fight in 6, and Barrett's character arc in 7. This is essentially the same thing as the second category of poorly executed subplots, in that they get brought up once and then get resolved with no actual story being told. The only real difference is that the third category has a bunch of unrelated stuff packed in the middle in order to hopefully cover up for the fact that the subplot has no middle to it. Well, Final Fantasy IX is no exception to this rule. About half the game's subplots fall into one of these three categories of poor execution. I've already talked about quite a few of them. For example, Dagger's desire to be kidnapped never gets properly paid off. It honestly feels like it was just there to get the plot moving and nothing more. Zidane's sudden desire to face Garland by himself without help from his friends just comes out of left field before being immediately resolved, as does Amarant's desire to work alone. Freya's lost love makes a single cameo appearance to save us, but his amnesia subplot never gets explored beyond that. Freya has heard rumors that he might actually be alive, but she can't understand why he wouldn't make contact with her if he was alive. The fact that he has amnesia certainly explains why he wouldn't make contact with her, but the problem there is that there was never any actual progression towards resolving that subplot. The mystery of why he would be out there but not contact Freya is brought up once. Then some unrelated stuff happens, and then this mystery gets its answer handed to us on a silver platter. But even then, I would be a lot more forgiving on this subplot if this were only the beginning of the subplot rather than the end. Now that we know that Freya's boyfriend is suffering from amnesia, it would be nice if we could embark on a side quest to get this guy his memory back. But nope, the closest we get to resolution of this subplot comes at the end of the game, when he and Freya are hooking back up despite him not remembering their past relationship. Either this is yet another instance of the subplot being resolved without player intervention, which is always unsatisfactory in a video game story, or it completely undermines the amnesia subplot in its entirety, because it means that the amnesia never even was a barrier to them getting back together in the first place, so why even have it there in the first place? I honestly can't tell which is worse. I mentioned how Steiner ultimately comes to respect Zidane. However, as I mentioned earlier, its execution is egregiously lacking. While I love Steiner as a character, I have to admit that his learning to respect Zidane just comes completely out of left field. It happens at about 80% of the main quest. Just out of flipping nowhere, Steiner starts referring to Zidane by his name, rather than simply calling him a scoundrel. There is no build-up to this sudden change in Steiner's attitude. One moment he hates Zidane's guts, then all of a sudden he's calling Zidane by his actual name. When Alexandria gets leveled right after Queen Brain dies, the 1-2 punch of losing her mother and her country in rapid succession drives Dagger into deep depression, causing her to lose her voice. Now bear in mind that this is exclusively a story handicap. Dagger is not permanently silenced in battle for the duration of this subplot. She can still cast her spells just fine. Anyway, Dagger's lost voice subplot is likewise resolved entirely off screen. Zidane ultimately gives her a pep talk, but by the time he does that, she has already regained her voice. There honestly should have been a quest to help Dagger regain her voice. That's not to say that all of the subplots in this game suffer from poor execution. The quest for the Super Soft is a competently written subplot. As we escape the evil forest, one of the guys, named Blank, gets turned to stone. Normal soft spells cannot undo this petrification. However, sometime later, some members of Tantalus have come up with the idea to obtain a legendary item called the Super Soft, which can undo any petrification, and so Dagger joins them in obtaining it. We then go on a quest to obtain the Super Soft, eventually obtaining it, and then Blank gets his petrification cured. There's nothing truly special about this subplot, but at least it has a clear beginning, middle, and end. There's also a subplot with Sid being turned into a bug-like creature called an Oglop, and then later a frog. He was turned this way because his wife Hilda was pissed off at him for cheating on her, and apparently you can't just divorce in this universe. Sid decides he wants to undo the spell, and since Hilda is nowhere to be found, he sends the player on a fetch quest to find the ingredients needed for a special potion. Yes, some actual fucking gameplay up in this shit, instead of it just getting resolved off screen. Well, we fetch the ingredients, but it only succeeds in turning Sid into a frog. We eventually do come across Hilda, and she turns him back into a man. However, there's no indication that he's actually learned his lesson about cheating on her. However, I still have to criticize the way in which the player finds Hilda. We actually find her deep within a place called Esto Gaza, a dormant volcano that supposedly hasn't been inhabited for hundreds of years. I mean, there are clearly man-made wooden planks we can walk over, and these planks haven't rotted away despite sitting here for hundreds of years without maintenance, but whatever, uninhabited for hundreds of years. Anyway, when we actually find Hilda, the room she's in is still furnished like a royal bedroom. So this clearly isn't a temporary holding cell. Clearly this is where Hilda is being permanently held. In a fucking dormant volcano! Am I the only one who finds that just a little bit head-scratching? In addition to all of those subplots, I have to praise Final Fantasy IX for doing something that no other Final Fantasy game up to this point has done. It directly references a subplot from a previous Final Fantasy game. In a section known as Pinnacle Rocks, Dagger, who has recently been stripped of all her summon spells, embarks on a quest to unlock Ramo as a summons. To prove herself worthy, she has to not only acquire various paragraphs of a 4-paragraph short story scattered across Pinnacle Rocks, but also has to put those 4 paragraphs in the correct order. When you put them in the right order, it tells the subplot of Joseph from Final Fantasy II. 3 heroes meet up with a 4th hero, Joseph. Joseph lent his snowmobile and they entered the snow cavern. They fight the Adamantoise, which is the dungeon's boss, and obtain the goddess Belle. On the way out, they fell into a trap and Joseph sacrificed his life to save the other heroes. It's a surprising nod to a past game that I honestly didn't expect out of this game, and it honestly made me wonder if this meant that this game takes place in the distant future, but otherwise in the same universe as Final Fantasy II. Now, if any of you were put off by how harshly I went on this game's subplots and character arcs, let me hopefully balance that out by offering the following opinion. This game has, hands down, the absolute best main plot in any Final Fantasy game up to this point. In Final Fantasy V, I praised its exploration of a main theme, specifically by using the crystals to create a parallel to the real-world problem of destroying our own planet in the pursuit of more and more natural resources. Well, Final Fantasy IX doesn't just explore a main theme, it explores several main themes. I was able to identify a total of 4 main themes over the course of the game, and none of them feel half-assed or only partially explored. The first main theme is one I already touched upon when I discussed Vivi's character, the inevitability of death and the fear of death. It is primarily explored through the Black Mage village as well as the main villain Kuja. Since Kuja is the main villain who drives the actual plot forward and this is his primary motivation, I consider this to be the primary main theme of the game. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Black Mages are manufactured, not born. Most of the Black Mages are just mindless drones who do nothing but blindly destroy and follow orders from Queen Brain. However, a few of them somehow manage to achieve sentience. It's not explained how they're able to do this. The mayor of Black Mage Village likens it to remembering one's own birth. He says that all of them just happen to become self-aware at some random point in their existence. Once they became self-aware, they suddenly understood that they were committing horrible atrocities, and so they fled to this village in the hopes that they could live peacefully. However, they clearly don't have a firm understanding of the concept of death. Only the mayor even refers to death as death. For everyone else, they just say that people stop moving. Some of them don't even seem to understand that death is permanent. One guy even ponders if his dead friend will eventually come back. Even in real life, where the inevitability of death is pretty well understood, it is all too natural to fear death. But these Black Mages don't even comprehend death in the first place. As the old saying goes, people fear what they don't understand. So when you compound their lack of understanding onto a concept that is already scary to begin with, their fear of death increases exponentially. This fear of death prompts them to return to the side of evil. They join Kuja and resume committing horrible atrocities, this time of their own accord. However, even though these things go against their moral code, they agree to do them because Kuja has promised to extend their lifespan if they serve him. To them, serving Kuja and committing acts of evil is the lesser of 2 evils compared to dying. Except, here's the thing. Kuja is lying about preventing their deaths. It is impossible to prevent death or even to prolong one's natural lifespan. Death is absolutely inevitable. It can't be stopped or even postponed. And the Black Mages know this. After they leave Kuja's service, they acknowledged that they knew all along that he was probably lying. But they went with it anyway because when you're scared as fuck and fear often clouds judgment. Because of this, the protagonists of the game are surprisingly forgiving of these mages and even entrust the mages later on with caring for the Terrarian refugees. As mentioned earlier, Vivi is able to overcome his fear of death, but that's only thanks to the help of his friends like Zidane. This leads to the second main theme of the game, surrounding oneself with the right people. Vivi learns to not think about death because he surrounds himself with people who understand death, and who teach him how to cope with his fear of death. The Black Mages, by contrast, isolate themselves from the rest of society and only surround themselves with each other. When you enter Black Mage Village for the first time, the inhabitants freak out, thinking that you've come to take them back into the fold and force them to go to war for your own selfish gains. Considering that this is literally the only interaction they've had with humans up to that point, I don't really blame them, but at the same time, that means they only surround themselves with each other, since they all have a crippling fear of death and a complete lack of understanding thereof. By only surrounding themselves with like-minded people, the fear only gets amplified in this echo chamber. further exasperating the problem. It's a powerful message that surrounding yourself with the right people can help you grow in the right ways. The third main theme I noticed is the dangers of blindly following orders simply because you were ordered to do so. The Black Mages were made, not born, for a specific purpose, and that purpose was to be weapons in a war. However, once they achieve sentience, they realize that this purpose for which they were created is morally fucked up. There isn't a single Black Mage who was known to have achieved sentience but still known to have remained loyal to Queen Brain. They served Kuja willingly, but as I said, they were offered something in return for that service, and Kuja played on their greatest fear to obtain their loyalty. Once they achieve sentience, they realize that they shouldn't just kill indiscriminately simply because it is their job to do so. Zidane's backstory also plays into this main theme. He was born on Terra and sent to Gaia for the purpose of destroying it. He was chosen for this mission because, as one of the few Terrarians who was born with free will, he was one of the only people who could be sent on this mission without Garland having to micromanage everything he did. However, as he grew up on Gaia, made friends, joined Tantalus, and developed his own personality, he ultimately ended up defying his mission, all because of the very thing that made him the ideal candidate for the mission in the first place, his free will. So that just leaves the fourth and final main theme of the game, the fact that actions have consequences, and that your previous crimes can't just be swept under the rug. Recall in Final Fantasy II that I criticized how Leon's past crimes of genocide and treason were instantly forgotten about simply because he decided to join the good guys near the end of the game. I guess all the innocent people who suffered and died at the hands of Leon and his soldiers are worth less than dick. There was no indication that Leon was under mind control or was otherwise being manipulated. No, just because he was Maria's big brother, he gets a full pardon for all of his most heinous crimes. Past Final Fantasy games addressed this problem by having the characters be under mind control when they did terrible things. Final Fantasy IV overdid the mind control excuse to the point where it honestly stopped being an excuse. Well, with Final Fantasy IX, we finally explore the opposite side of that coin. Queen Brain is on a conquest to conquer the entire world. She isn't under mind control by Kuja. Kuja is merely providing her with the means to create Black Mages. Now that she has an army of Black Mages who obey her every command like good little drones, the lust for infinite power that has always lurked deep inside her is now coming to the surface, now that she finally has a means of realizing that dream. As she invades the outer continent, she suddenly finds herself in over her head. Kuja is easily able to overpower her, and while she does use her escape pod to get washed up onto the shore, the force of the explosion was still lethal to her. With her dying breath, she says that she is free of her previous greed, not free of the spell that was making her do these terrible things. By Brain's own admission, she committed all these atrocities entirely of her own accord, simply because she could. But unlike Leon from Final Fantasy II, Brain pays the ultimate price for her cruelty. Meanwhile, the two jesters, Zorn and Thorn, are another big example of this main theme of actions having consequences. They begin the game in service to Queen Brain, and they do her evil bidding without question. Unlike Beatrix, however, Zorn and Thorn never rebel against Brain, even going as far as to surgically extract Dagger's summon spells from her body. When Queen Brain dies, they naturally find themselves disgraced and out on the streets. They ultimately go to work for Kuja, and while it's never confirmed why, I'd like to think it's because that's literally the only way they can get work now that they're disgraced. After all, right before their demise, they show even the slightest bit of humanity, the slightest indication that they might not simply be evil. When tasked with removing the summonables from Ego's body, they show hesitation at the prospect. They inform Kuja that removing the summonables from a person's body before they are 16 years old would kill the host. This implies that Zorn and Thorn would likely have had some reservations about performing that ritual on Dagger if she were under 16. This may suggest that Zorn and Thorn are not simply unscrupulous. And yet, that's what they get for aiding in these atrocities. Maybe they should have used that moral compass when they were aiding Queen Brain in committing these war crimes in the first place. It's not like Brain's forces weren't killing millions of people thanks to the magic you were performing. Suddenly you're worried about killing one teenage girl? I don't think so. Just like the Third Reich generals immediately after World War II, you learn the hard way that the excuse of "I was just following orders" is not an excuse at all. So, overall, the main plot is absolutely the best the series had up to this point. The villain isn't terribly deep, he just wants to rule both Gaia and Terra for its own sake, but it's the exploration of not one, but 4 central themes during this main plot that ultimately makes it so great. However, all good things must come to an end, and this game's end is just absolutely atrocious. Okay, do you remember in Final Fantasy IV when I complained about how the game swapped out main villains right before the final boss fight for absolutely no good reason? Well, you know what? They did it again, motherfucker! Immediately after you defeat Kuja, it looks like we're finally ready to do the ending cutscenes, but nope. Out of the fucking blue, a new enemy appears and says he wants to destroy all of existence so that... Dear God, am I saying this right? You know, in Final Fantasy II, I gave that game hell for ripping off the plot of the original Star Wars trilogy, but this doesn't even qualify as a ripoff. It's a copy and paste job. Did they pay royalties to George Lucas for this shit? Because this feels like the sort of thing where they should be legally required to pay royalties to George Lucas for this shit. But even if this isn't copyright infringement per se, it is still fucking scummy that they would show such lack of originality. With Final Fantasy II, the overarching narrative might have been a blatant ripoff of the original trilogy, but at least they changed enough about the story to make it their own, like changing the Death Star to the Dreadnought and stuff like that. But this, they aren't making this their own. They're literally just copying the dialogue wholesale. What, did they think we wouldn't notice? Like this wasn't copied from one of the biggest movie franchises of all fucking time, and we wouldn't immediately recognize this as a total fucking ripoff? So, we fight not Yoda. We defeat not Yoda. And we finally get our ending. For realsies this time. Also, Kuja turned good at the last minute, as if that has any effect on anything. Zidane and Dagger finally express their affections for each other, but of course they don't actually kiss, and then everyone lives happily ever after. Great main plot, ruined by a completely shitty ending. Final Fantasy IX was a case of highs and lows, but mostly highs. The graphics and sound were an improvement over Final Fantasy VIII, but seeing as how that game is ranked at the bottom of the list so far, that's not saying much. The main quest had a greatly appreciated sense of direction to it, but it would have been very nice if the side quests had a similar amount of sense of direction. Combat was incrementally better than any Final Fantasy game that has come before it, but sadly Final Fantasy VII still has the best mini-games in the entire franchise. The subplots in this game were hit or miss, but the main plot was muy magnifique. Immediately after I finished playing this game, I knew that when it came to rank this sucker, I was going to have to make a choice between placing this at the top of the list so far, or between 5 and 7. 9 has a better main plot than 5 does, but I can't think of any subplots that 5 completely dropped the ball on. 5 has some meaningful character development, but 9 is able to provide characterization to a lot more playable characters, even if fewer of them get character arcs. However, 5 also didn't bait and switch the player with a new main villain at the last minute for no good reason. That alone is a huge strike against 9. For this reason, I decided to rank this game in between Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VII. It was close, really close, but 5 succeeds in just slightly more ways than 9 does. Next time, I will be reviewing the last game to be directed by Yoshinori Kitase, the first game on the 6th generation of consoles, the first game in the series to have voice acting, and the only game in the series that I have personally played prior to doing this retrospective series, Final Fantasy X, originally for the PlayStation 2, but I will be playing the HD remaster on PC. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoyed my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!